I'm Chris Walker at the International Forum for Democratic Studies. Welcome to another edition of Democracy Ideas. We're delighted to have with us today Javier Corrales, professor of political science at Amherst College, to discuss authoritarianism in Venezuela. Javier, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Javier, given the leadership change in Venezuela, how do you see the country developing in the coming period? Do you see it becoming more authoritarian or less authoritarian, and why?
There are probably two theories. There are some folks who say that the regime is facing so many pressures that it may have to somehow yield. And there are those who feel that no, that as the regime becomes less competitive electorally, as the regime loses the ability to gather all the votes, all the masses that Chavez used to gather, it will feel more insecure, and therefore it will have to devise new ways to repress the opposition or to make life harder for the opposition. Because it cannot grow its majority, it will need to create more obstacles for the growth of the opposition. And although it's perhaps too early to tell, my impression of the first year of, less than a year of the Maduro administration is that they have increased the authoritarian aspects of the regime. There are aspects of the regime that remain democratic, and they are there, but the way that they have concentrated power in the executive branch, the way that they're dealing with the opposition, whom they call traitors rather than the opposition, conspirators, the way that they have incorporated the military into the government, the way that they have tried to manipulate the votes in the National Assembly, the way that they're dealing with the press, the way that they're dealing with elected officials, are all things that you do not expect to see in a democracy. So, in my opinion, it is moving in the direction of increasing rules, formal and informal, that are disadvantageous to the opposition.
And Javier, in the post-Hugo Chavez era, what do you see as the regime's most important basis for its legitimacy?
Well, this is a polarizing administration. And for the opposition, there's no legitimacy whatsoever. The opposition doesn't even think that that Maduro won the presidential election of earlier 2013. So the key question is, has Maduro been able to regain legitimacy within the Chavistas? This was an open question. This is an area where people had many doubts. And I have to say that credit to Maduro, he has been able to become accepted by all the followers of Chavez. There are many ways in which he has done this. He himself has portrayed his government as nothing other than an extension of Chavez. He doesn't even try to sell himself as an improvement or a modification, but this is what Chavez would do if he were here. And so he has won over the radicals among Chavistas, the civilian radicals. He has won over the military sections, and he has also won over a group of folks who were Chavistas light. In other words, they were not necessarily committed ideologically, but they weren't necessarily ready to vote against it. And Maduro has done this, and it's perhaps his biggest achievement, but that only covers half of the country.
And in institutional terms, what do you see as the regime's most important instrument or methods for domestic control?
Look, it's very important that we are aware of what's going on here. On the one hand, this is a state that has expanded the size of the public payroll and the size of the public sector. And it has an enormous capacity to spend money and to deny money to other folks. So through the public sector and through public spending, the government is able to reward and to punish. So this is element number one. The second element is that it's an oil state, and what we mean by this is that the only sector of the economy that generates dollar revenues is oil, and oil is a monopoly of the state. There are no other actors who export anything in Venezuela. So there's no economic class that has access to dollars. And the Venezuelan regime uses the market for dollars to assign rewards and punishments, and this is huge. And finally, probably the third element is arbitrariness of controls. The regime believes in hyper-controlling every aspect of politics and every aspect of economics. Price controls in economics, for example, but in politics, what you are allowed to say or not say in the press. The way the regime exercises control is by arbitrarily applying these controls, sometimes letting you get away with not enforcing these controls, but then always telling you, we can come back and get you in trouble for that.
And in the regional context, Javier, do you believe Venezuela will be able to exert the same degree of influence that it has over the course of the past decade?
Well, there are two aspects to Venezuela's international influence. One is to make sure that there is never an international coalition against domestic politics in Venezuela. On that front, Venezuela, under Chavez, was absolutely successful. Maduro was foreign minister, and he has been able to establish a basically situation in the international arena, and especially in the hemisphere, where we shouldn't expect any other government adopt a diplomatic position that would be unfavorable to Venezuela's government interest. That part is going well for the Venezuelan government. What's not going very well is, in my opinion, the expansion of Chavista-like forces throughout Latin America. This was a very important part of Chavez's. It went very far in the mid-2000s. You saw the expansion of Chavista-like forces in many countries. But my view is that this has peaked since 2008, when I think we saw the last election of somebody who was a little bit of a Chavista-like figure, and this was President Lugo in Paraguay. There have been a number of elections, and in none of those elections do you see a Chavista-like candidate winning or doing very well. So it has peaked. By peaking, I do not mean it has disappeared. Chavismo remains a very appealing ideology in many countries. It's probably not right now in ascendance or dominating, and it may come back.
And one of the other features of Venezuela's international diplomacy under Chavez was building relationships with some of the world's most repressive regimes, including Belarus, Iran, Russia, China. How do you see that continuing under Maduro?
Well, Maduro was a fundamental part of that diplomacy from Hugo Chavez as foreign minister. My impression is that because Maduro has inherited such a difficult situation at home, he has not invested in those relations. But the incentive to return to those and invest in relations with these type of regimes is there. Venezuela needs partnerships with countries that are stronger than Venezuela is. Its partners in the Americas, the so-called ALBA, are small, weak economies that depend more on Venezuela, get more out of Venezuela than perhaps Venezuela gets out of them. So Venezuela needs big allies, and that explains the need to go outside of the region for allies. But it also needs these allies to be secretive, because the government is engaged and likes to be able to engage in a lot of secret business deals. And if you're working with a democracy, those deals are going to be scrutinized with the public of other democracies. So you have a major incentive to mostly have your most important economic transactions with non-democratic countries, because there you can assure a certain degree of non-transparency. And many of these regimes provide the opportunity to have secret deals, or deals that can be kept secret far more than would be the case with democracy.
Javier Corrales, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was my pleasure.